Hello. Let's see. Hey, are you there?
Hi. Yeah, I'm here.
Hey, we're
Hi.
we're good to go. We are recording. So do you want to just let's I'm gonna just open it up then and just we're gonna be discussing intimacy by design, which
Awesome.
is a course that you are leading, and it starts, correct me if I'm wrong, June 12th.
Yep, next Wednesday, June 12th.
And we've discussed a little bit already about intimacy by design and your larger image and your larger project and your larger vision. So if you would like to introduce people to you and what you do, what motivates you, what drives you, and then maybe a little bit about intimacy by design, because in this video we're going to be going into the depths of what you're up to.
Awesome. Oh my goodness, there's a lot of different invitations there. So the who am I and what am I up to in the world? Um, what I do in the world is inspired by my own personal journey of becoming who I am. Who I am in the world is someone who cares very deeply about being connected to my core essence, my core truth, and living from that place in every moment as much as feasibly possible.
Mhm.
I see that in the culture that I live in, American culture, living from that core essence can be incredibly challenging because we've been conditioned to believe that we are not inherently okay as we are, that we cannot trust our natural impulses and inclinations, that they perhaps are even sinful because they're associated with desire, they're associated with sexuality, and that we need to purchase things outside of us in order to validate our worthiness of being human. The place that I've been most interested in how this shows up is the way that we're taught to engage in romantic relationship. I'm in my early 30s right now, and I would say that I was a late bloomer around dating and sexuality. I never dated in college, and I never dated in high school. And then when I got into college, I was, like many of us, just kind of thrust into a world where there's no parents around, and we're supposed to look hot. We're supposed to go out and date and drink and hook up. And
Yeah.
I was
Hookup
obsessed.
culture.
Hookup culture, which I believe is the antithesis to community.
Oh,
And
nice.
yes, and I was an insecure, like I was insecure, and simultaneously had a very strong desire to fall in love with a man, to find my partner. So I wound up having a lot of sex, like a lot of empty sex with men, where I didn't know what I wanted. I wasn't actually connected to my body. I was terrified of asking for what I wanted because I was so concerned about being an inconvenience or needy to the man that I was just more constantly focused on his experience. So much so that I couldn't even fall asleep in bed after having sex with a man because I was so afraid of just being myself. So
Wow.
I know.
This is
And
such a nice intro and background. So keep going. This is so interesting.
I'm so glad to hear that. So that was, I had a really wonderful experience in college. So my background is I have a BA in clinical counseling psychology with a minor in philosophy. I went to a small liberal arts school where I also got to play volleyball full time. I'm a great volleyball player, and I loved school. And combining my challenging relationships with men and sexuality with a total fixation around the shape of my body. In college, was obsessed with counting calories and obsessing over my weight. And I wound up yo-yoing back and forth between binge eating and chronic dieting throughout most of my college years. So there was really this focus around like the inherent fear that I was unlovable exactly as I was. And that followed me out of college. I thought I was going to go get a PhD in clinical counseling psychology, but instead I decided that I wanted to go to California and get a culinary degree because I was a pastry chef in college while I was learning. And I took these challenges with me. I got to this point with food, where I was working in school, or I was working in a cafe after I'd graduated from school, and I got to this point with food where there was this one pair of like size 6 pants that I really wanted to fit into, and I would just try and squeeze myself into them every night, and I couldn't fit into them. And I got to this place where I went from trying to squeeze myself into these jeans to actually trying to rip them to shreds with my thigh muscles. And I had this moment of realizing, wow, this thing that I've been wanting to fit myself into, I actually hate. And it's not actually me. And it's actually consuming all of my energy trying to make myself small. So that actually propelled me into a completely different trajectory with my life, where I wound up exploring eating psychology, getting certified as an eating psychology coach, looking at our relationship with food, with body, with pleasure, and with our ability to stay present in the act of receiving something into our bodies while being nourished. And as you might imagine, the other aspect that really came up for me in that process was my sexuality, my ability to be nourished and receive pleasure by, as a woman, receiving something inside of me, and my ability to actually stay present in that experience. So my mid-20s were mainly characterized by getting myself into a lot of rather intense monogamous relationships where I didn't know the man that well, but I was so obsessed with the idea of him being my partner that I would wind up just disconnecting from my intuition, my own path, and my own internal guidance system. And the metaphor I like to use with clients and in videos and stuff like that is I jumped off my own ship and swam to this other person's ship, and I had no way of getting back to my own ship, or I made it really difficult for me to get back to my own ship. And I wound up just going through these series of experiences of self-abandonment because of the idea of finding that one.
Really nice metaphor.
Thank you. And I remember getting to this place where I had gotten myself out of the seriously emotionally abusive relationships, and then, you know, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, found myself in a relationship with a man who was incredibly sweet and also struggled with depression. And I got to this place where I was sitting in bed by myself. He was in the living room. And I was just realizing that I have had probably at this point like 60 or 70 sexual experiences at that point in my life. And the amount of truly pleasurable sexual experiences where I was able to communicate my desires and feel good and feel present and receive pleasure was very small. And that the common denominator, as much as I would have liked to blame the men, you know, for how they weren't showing up, I was the common denominator. And long story short, I went on quite a transformational journey and self-exploration around different modalities and sexuality and embodiment. And now a lot of the work that I do is support people in different forms around creating deep intimacy with self and creating alignment between who their core essence is, what their core desires are, and how they express themselves in their external reality, so we can actually experience that sense of meaning, that sense of fulfillment, of purpose and magic that is available to us in this life.
So now, after that beautiful introduction, we're starting to approach here intimacy by design, I think. I'm starting to see the contours of what your idea is for intimacy by design. But and I want to go really deep into that. But first, I want to just spend maybe a little bit of time talking about your journey here and some of the things you brought up. So do you think that connecting to the core is an American problem or a human problem? And how would you differentiate between those two? Like, do you think it's something that Americans or people in capitalism or people in the West experience as problematic, or is this a universal human issue?
It's a good question, and I would say my response will my response will be limited because I have not done a significant amount of research into this. That being said, I do believe this is a human issue. And what I know and experience of America is that we are a young culture, that we're not truly, we're not accurately taught of our history.
Mm-hmm.
And there's not really a culture to us.
Mm-hmm.
You know, our culture is fast food. You know, I would say like maybe New Orleans is culture or things of that nature, but there aren't many castles in America.
Castles are culture.
Yeah, well, I just, like, for example,
Yeah.
in Europe, for example,
Yeah.
the conversation around sexuality at the table. What was that man's name who went to the different cultures around the world and picked out his favorite things? He also did the 9/11 documentary.
Oh, Michael Moore.
Michael Moore. I remember he actually went to Germany, and the thing that he plucked out of his favorite thing about Germany was the way that they educated their children about their past,
Right.
so that they would never forget. That's not something that America does. And America is fixated on the young, the fast, the new. And I'm not saying that the rest of the world doesn't have that experience, but I see when I experience people from European cultures, for example, in terms of their level of self-awareness and the intimacy, and I'm not saying everyone is like this, I just notice there's a bit of a different energy going on, and America is facing some pretty intense demons right now.
I want to put out the idea that America seems to be going through a cultural convulsion with its history. Mm-hmm. Like, because I think, and it could be related to race, it could be related to many different things, but like it could be that America's redefining an identity at this moment or something like that. But I agree with what you're saying. It's really interesting to think about how connecting to a history is essential for an identity, right? Mm-hmm. And community. So, and that's another thing I wanted to bring up that you pointed on, and I agree with you. You were saying that you were a part, or that you experienced hookup culture, and that this is the antithesis of community. And so, could you go into a little bit of detail about what you think the traps are of hookup culture, and how you can have liberated sex and desire and like talk about those things, but at the same time put an emphasis on community and social identity and history?
Totally. So it's funny, what really spurred this for me is I was like maybe a year ago, I forget where I was, but I was on Netflix and I saw this documentary, and I think it was called like The New Sexual Revolution or something like that. I was like, oh, I'm curious to see what this is. And then I clicked on it, and it wound up being a documentary of spring break culture in America, and witnessing this documentary, witnessing the norm of how late teenagers, early 20-somethingers are interacting with each other, objectifying each other, agendaing and pursuing each other, completely disconnecting emotion or empathy or sensitivity or care for the other's experience, but instead just
fucking.
Just fucking. And it's not just fucking, but the way, like seeing the way the young men would be speaking about the women across the room, and the way that women are so conditioned to want to be that.
Right.
Want to be the, oh yeah, he wants me. And the sadness there, because what winds up happening is usually one of two things. It's usually one, the hookup does happen, and then there's this physical intimacy that occurs where there's absolutely no emotional intimacy. And then usually, I'm generalizing now, but then someone will be dropped because there's a lack of cultivation of intimacy skills to be able to cultivate the relationship afterwards. Or the hookup doesn't happen, and then insecurity and the ego gets involved, or it's like someone says no, and then there's ghosting. And then there's just avoidance. And there's multiple problems with this, but one of the problems with this is that we've gotten used to being in a culture where we know that we don't need to see a person the next day. We are so used to assuming that, oh, I'm never going to see this person again, that we give ourselves permission to really be careless around connection. It's kind of like I'd parallel it to the way some people will scream at other people from the car. Right? We're driving and it's like, oh, there's no risk here for me to curse at this person from the car. Another parallel to this is my college thesis was the effects of excessive reliance on text messaging when delivering emotionally sensitive information, which was actually inspired by a man who broke up with me via text message.
Yeah, my first girlfriend broke up to me via text message as well. So I agree with this. This is I love what you're bringing up. These are very interesting themes.
It's an important conversation because my perspective is that the way the world is going, what is unfolding in the environment, in culture, in politics, and economics, that what makes most sense and what seems like the next evolution of humanity is to come back to community culture. Yeah. Where there's tribe and where we actually know each other and where our gifts are being actualized and utilized in service to the community.
Okay, so what I want to run by you with this, we're going back to community culture or a new type of community culture is that, and I want to say this just because you're coming from the American context, I want to situate this in the American context, is that America was a deeply religious country and is often seen as like the most religious of the Western countries. And in my experience of being with Christian families in America is that they are, at least the ones who are very authentically, Christian, is that it is a family. It's about family and community. And I think that in our generation, we're obviously maybe tending away from religion a little bit in social structures. And also that religion does speak to a certain sexual norms. So where do you see, going back to a community culture and going back to connection and intimacy, how do we sort of navigate that territory maybe without that old religious scaffolding? Or, does it bring up religious questions for you or spiritual questions for you?
Yes. So yes, it does bring up that question because to me, with much of religion, there is family orientation, yet there are a lot of hoops to jump through, especially around anything that is taboo or considered sinful. It's like you can be in the family conditionally if you meet this criteria. And there's like, for example, whether it's homophobia or I work a lot with the transgender community. So is that family there regardless of who you are and how you show up in the world?
Right. And when I visited some Christian families, for example, I would say conversations about authenticity of desire, which is kind of your thing, would be taboo.
Yeah.
Big
time. So what I'll speak to, have you ever read the book The Celestine Prophecy or seen the movie or anything like that?
No.
So I'll speak to this theory because it actually relates very much with what I believe to be true. And basically the Celestine prophecy speaks to this ancient prophecy where it essentially states that there is a universal energy that connects us all. And there is also a great mystery to this life. And that the more we are connected to this universal energy, this divine consciousness that is the creation of everything, the more life becomes this beautiful unfoldment of being guided towards our destiny. That the world, that the universe is actually constantly speaking to us through signs, through nature, through people, through circumstances, guiding us towards the unfoldment of our purpose. Yet the challenge is that humanity became disconnected from this source energy, and we became insecure of our relationship to it. And as a result, because we became disconnected from this source energy, we started to believe that resources were finite, that source energy was finite. And we started to battle for energy, which we can also redefine as power over other people. We actually believed that there was a limited amount of power, so that we needed to battle over other people to steal their energy, or that we needed to give our power, give our energy away in order to be accepted. And what I would say is that moving into community culture is requiring a re-acknowledgement that everything that we need, all of the energy, all of the life force, all of the power that we need actually exists within our bodies. And that if we cultivate presence and connection to the earth and connection to source, that we can have a constant flow of life force energy flowing through us, guiding us towards our self-actualization in connection with others, in service to creating heaven on earth.
Right.
And I believe this is what community can be.
Right. So, as you know, and we're going to keep this focused. We're going to keep this focused on you, but I think it is directly relevant to us transitioning into conversations about intimacy by design. But as you know, I'm doing a course on the unconscious, and they would say that the universal energy is the libido. And so they would talk about libidinal energy. And then you would, and like from the foundation of discovery of this libidinal energy, they would connect it to questions of purpose and why and value, and that we're disconnected from this, and that we have to better psychoanalyze ourselves so that we understand the energy of our body and how it moves, and better understand how we become men and women, and how do we relate our sexual energy and stuff like this. And it was seen as very taboo for the church because we're talking about sex and all this type of stuff, right? So I think there's a direct connection there. And then the question is, oftentimes this sexual energy becomes or just this divine energy, or whatever we want to call it, this, you could say, connection to source. It becomes very not just taboo to talk about it, but it becomes very difficult to navigate the boundaries with this energy. And it becomes very difficult to be self-conscious and aware enough of this energy to know that you're not abusing it or misusing it or deceiving yourself or deceiving the other, right? So yes. I'm assuming that this Intimacy by Design course is kind of like approaching the edges and the boundaries of these questions. Would that be...
There is so much there.
Yeah.
There's so much there.
Yeah, I wanted to throw it at you.
Yeah, there's so much. I want to speak to that and then go into Intimacy by Design.
Sure.
So a lot of what I speak to in my work, especially lately, is the fear that so many people have of fully inhabiting our sexual energy, which I do parallel to source energy, to creative energy, because there's been so much shame. Anything that there is shame, taboo, or stigma around, it is incredibly difficult to have right relationship with it, because we've been conditioned to believe that it's wrong for us to be open to connection with it, because that makes us dirty or wrong by default. Yeah. So if shame exists, it is actually an impediment to cultivating mastery over our personal power. And often what will happen is that because we haven't cultivated our relationship to this energy, I don't know if you're familiar with the chakra systems at all. I'm not an expert in this, but ideally what happens is that there is an even distribution of energy between all of our chakras, or we're in conscious awareness of it. But the challenge for a lot of people is that because we aren't cultivated around our sexual energy, and because it's such a powerful energy, when we do open to it, so much of it winds up getting channeled just in our lower chakras, that we don't actually have it connected to our heart, to our communication, to our intuition, to our clarity, and we'll wind up just kind of checking out into the sensation and the carnal nature of desire.
Yeah. So I was just say to that is that, like, just because it's so fresh in my mind, is that in this psycho-developmental view of the libido, like all of the problems start to emerge when this energy gets concentrated in the genital region. And then it's like, then we develop all these psychopathologies about it because it's such an intense enjoyment and it's such an intense energy, and we don't have the space to talk about it. So then all these, you know, we run into all these problems. So
beautiful.
So
this feels, okay.
Yeah. So well, I'm just trying to say I agree with you about this chakra system, like that. I think that this view of the body where you have this huge energy source, which you might say starts around even I think our genital region has a nervous system kind of, and it's like, you know, it has a mind and it moves, and it, you know, and then you have this energy system, which is like you said in your journey. I was very fascinated by your journey about food, right? So it moves up to the stomach and the heart and all of the other systems we have, and up to our minds for clarity. And we get confused in our minds about sex because it's not all connected, right? So maybe speak a little bit to maybe, you know, how do we talk about these integrations and stuff like that?
Could you reframe the question?
Like, well, I was feeling where you were going with with your reference to the chakras with the lower energy, and then you had experience also with food and how that was connected and all the systems, right? So from our lower systems to our upper system, and then and to our minds basically, and developing clarity. And we can't develop clarity with our, you know, these intense energies because it's all concentrated in the genitals, and then it becomes hookup culture.
Yeah. So the direction that I was going to go before you asked that question, and I see where it's all connected, is that the biggest piece is that we must be able to cultivate self-awareness. Yeah. And what I mean by self-awareness is there are many different perspectives that we can inhabit. There's one of them things I'm familiar is there's the 3 perspective system, which is the first perspective is like, this is my experience. This is what I'm having. And then the second perspective is I'm aware of the other person's experience. And then the third perspective is I'm actually able to step back and witness the container of experience that is occurring. Okay. And ideally, what must happen, in my opinion, to be able to recirculate this energy and gain mastery and composure of our energy is the ability to actually be able to step out of first perspective, which when we don't have self-awareness, first perspective is the main place that we're always living, where we're just identifying with everything. Yeah. Where there's not an ability to become curious of, is this my anger, or is this old anger that actually isn't even true anymore? When we don't have self-awareness, we can often become victims of patterns that were cultivated when we were very young. Yep. And there's such vulnerability and defensiveness around these old patterns that when we don't have self-awareness, it can be nearly impossible to change, because when a person questions us, if we're only in first perspective and we're identifying with the pattern, it can feel like someone is literally trying to kill us. Yep. So self-awareness is actually what allows us to step back and realize that we have choice, and that there's actually more freedom, more possibility, more joy and fulfillment available to us than the limited first perspective that we are trained to believe is the only perspective. Right. So being able to step back and become aware, and this is a lot of why people come to me to work with me. They get to this point where they realize that there's a pattern that keeps happening in their life that is detrimental, that is painful, that is traumatic, and they've gotten to this point where blaming other people isn't getting them off in the same way that it used to.
It's so well said. So my question for you very quickly is, I think that if you now say I'm 20 and I've never had a romantic partnership or something like that, or I've just, I've never dated or something like that, and you tell me all this abstractly. Now, and I say I understand it abstractly, but I haven't experienced that trauma. I haven't gone through those patterns. Do you feel like we need to make these mistakes in order to come to this realization? Or is it something that we could actually educate people about? Is this something what a spiritual community would be about, really?
Yes, I believe that my path is relationship and sexuality as the path to awakening. And what I would say is that even if you've never been in a romantic relationship, you're still in relationship with yourself. And there are
Yeah.
still stories going on in your head that are completely ruling your beliefs about who you think you're worthy of, who you think is worthy of you, why you do or don't go and talk to the person that you're attracted to, what you believe you're able to achieve in your life. We're in relationship with everything. And essentially what we're talking about is moving out of a state of victim consciousness and
Yeah.
into a state of creator consciousness. And that we can actually utilize, and this is where we can shift into intimacy by design, we can actually utilize our relationships as a pathway towards our self-actualization.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I totally love the flow of your logic and everything that you're saying, because, from my level, from, more approaching it from the academic side, it's almost, it's like an intuitive rediscovery of what I would call psychoanalysis, because it's all about, it's exactly everything you're saying is exactly, the basic logic, because it starts with the libidinal energy. And the problem is the history and the trauma and the connection to narratives which circulate around that history and that trauma. And then overcoming all of these symptoms of our identity to connect deeper with the fullness of our consciousness. So it's all very connected. But now let's go into intimacy by design itself, because it's a very exciting project, and I think a lot of people could benefit from it. And I'm so excited to see what you learn. Is this the first time you're doing it? Is it? And what, if not, what did you learn from previous versions? And let's start there.
Beautiful. So this is my first time running this specific course, Intimacy by Design. I have been running other courses for the past 3 years. For example, I have an all-women's course called Appetite. It's also an online course, and it's an all-female container looking at the resistance that we as women have towards accessing deep levels of our desire and bringing our self-expression out into the world. So I've really been cultivating what it means to hold a transformational container for a group virtually. And the two pieces that I want to talk about around intimacy by design are both the way our self-actualization can be limited or opened up by the relationships that we have in our life, and what a container actually is, and why it is so important as a means towards expediting our growth exponentially. So
Yeah.
ultimately, who we choose to surround ourselves with in our most intimate circles, while it is not 100% going to dictate who we become, it has such a significant impact that it can really make or break where we go in our life. And
Right.
we can look at this as, just the fear of going way back when we were when we were in tribe culture, there was fear of being ostracized from the tribe. Like if we did something that the community disagreed with and we got ostracized or rejected from the community, that could mean death for us, because the community were where our resources were, it was where fire was, it was where safety was. And we don't necessarily have that tribe or community culture in America right now, but we do have social hierarchy. We do have religious hierarchy. And when we are born into a certain demographic, there can be, especially in demographics that aren't focused on spiritual awakening and progressive evolution and opening up to higher and higher states of consciousness. If what I experience with a lot of the people that I work with is they'll have this inclination to want to open up and expand, but their current community circle is not open to that evolution yet. Mm-hmm. And to experience a person who is on that evolutionary path by a person who is not on that evolutionary path is incredibly threatening. Because if a person is waking up to the truth of who they are and taking responsibility, and you see that as someone who is either consciously or unconsciously afraid of realizing that there is more to life than the black and white of what we've been taught, that is a dangerous thing to witness. And people can often lash out from a place of shaming or making wrong or violence. So this can happen on the microcosm level of genocide or whatever you might say there, or this can occur on such a micro level of not being liked anymore by our friends or being judged by what we're interested in. So if we want to, and let's take this to romantic relationship, the number one thing that I see limiting people self-evolving, self-actualizing in relationship is the fear of being judged or rejected or made wrong by the partner. And what often winds up happening in romantic relationship is that while we want to be able to be free and grow and evolve, so often our romantic relationships become prisons of suspended identity, where we
Well
come into.
said. That was fantastic.
Thank you. And yeah, it just came through. And what I mean by that is we meet a person, and then we get a snapshot of who we believe this person is. And then identity forms. There's like an enmeshment like of root systems around the identity that we became attached to when we met this person. And what can happen if both people aren't committed to the evolutionary awakening path is when one person wants to start to grow and evolve, inevitably it starts messing with the root system of the other person that's gotten locked into place around this fixed identity that they've become attached to. And it can be incredibly threatening, not just for the person who's attached to the identity, but for the person who wants to grow and evolve into something that, let's face it, is kind of terrifying and unknown, because it requires us to step into a completely different framework of who we are. And that is why I find that in many ways, the awakening path can seem easier in many ways being single, because there's not constantly a need to self-check in.
Yeah.
However,
I think this is the location of the spiritual problem. And here's my challenge is that how does this location, you're doing such a beautiful job articulating this location of the spiritual problem. How does this transit? Because I think here, this next step is where in the past, this is where religion would evolve. Does that make sense? Like, because religion evolved in human history and human civilization, and then all comes in all the rules and norms which would solidify certain identities. So I think like that, and that would be the trap, you know?
Well, so this is where the repression of the feminine and the false pedestaling of the masculine comes in. So religion is inherently a masculine structure.
I agree.
And I've been doing a lot of reading and research into alternative perspectives on the relationship between Mary Magdalene and Jesus and how so much of that storyline unfolded. And what I'm reading is speaking to the eradication of the primary female figures and the feminine components of what led to the unfoldment of creation. And the feminine, in this sense, is the willingness to wade into the waters of the unknown and allow for something to emerge that is inherently unpredictable and uncontrollable. In its ideal form,
now this something unpredictable and uncontrollable is that, would you say, is that the responsible masculine or something like that?
I would say that is right relationship between masculine and feminine energies. So
you're trying to articulate a relationship between the dynamics of masculine and feminine.
Yes, because what I heard you say is we got to this point in relationship where the root systems are being threatened, and this one person is wanting to open up into an identity that is yet to be known. And that unknown thing can be deemed threatening because it's not controllable. it's not systematizable. You might be able to predict, you might be able to feel into what might this become based upon who I am and what my desires are and what wants to emerge. But it's not a controllable force. And for a country that has been built on control and systemization and consumerism and predictability, that freedom, that empowered evolution threatens the fabric of what society has been built upon.
Well, okay, so here's an interesting thing. And again, I'm just going to situate this in the American context, because if you ask many, like your stereotypical American, like in terms of like, I'm culturally American, I know just an image comes to my mind. I think it probably, and maybe I'm Canadian. So a certain image is coming to my mind of what that is. I think just from your smile, I think what that is. And but when I think of that person, I think if I'm at the bar with that guy or that girl, I think what they would say is that America stands for and has always stood for historically freedom. Like they would say freedom. But now what you're saying is that the culture is not based on that. And could that be because it's a freedom which is a not understanding sexual energy? It's like we're free, but we're not understanding sexual energy freedom. It's
childish freedom. And actually childish isn't the right word, because children actually have such a beautiful freedom. But what I would say is it's freedom at the expense of connection.
Okay. That's nice.
I'm going to do what I want to do when I want to do it. And I don't give a fuck how it impacts you.
I see.
And like, I'll reframe it to the context of relationship. Like, there's a lot of freedom in being single, right?
Yeah.
And simultaneously, as a person who's preparing herself for deep sacred partnership, I can intuitively feel through my self-cultivation and preparing to receive a partner who's my energetic match and who I can go into the depths of intimacy with, that there is a level of freedom that is available through partnership, through connection with another person, that cannot be accessed in isolation. And what I would say is that Americans saying that it's all about freedom, they don't know what true freedom is. Similar to a victim might think that their only power lies in their ability to pull the victim card. But once they shift from victim to creator, there's a whole new definition of what power and freedom is, where we no longer need to blame other people for our circumstances or point fingers. And instead, we realize that we are the supreme creators of our reality, and that based upon what we believe to be true and what we feel and what we think and what we focus our attention on, everything can change.
Mm-hmm. So then in this space of identifying, what I would say to me, what you're identifying is this space which I've, become more and more aware of, which is this difficult knot with, say, freedom and intimacy, or you might say desire and love. I've read, for example, there's a few people I can name, but one that's coming to mind is Esther Perel. She identifies, in her book, Mating in Captivity, she talks about how desire and love are kind of like this impossible knot. And, and she's, dealing with couples who are dealing with, this issue in long-term relationships and stuff. So, but when you're identifying here this space, and then you're sort of situating intimacy by design by that is, how are these discussions unfolding? How are you building containers, and yep. what could people expect if they want to join Intimacy by Design?
Yeah, beautiful. So in a first conversation that we had together, Cadell, I remember you speaking about how, like, I brought up the term container. Yeah. And when it seemed that when I said container, what you were actually saying is that the containers in like academia seem to be limited. Like there's kind of like a fixed nature to it's like the rules. Like these are the rules. Mm-hmm.
Let me just, I'll try and give a very quick condensed situation of how you could situate container as something different than what I would see in the literature.
Please,
It would be
please.
so it would be oftentimes in academia, and you might see this in activist disciplines a lot, like for example, like a post-colonial studies or a feminist studies or something like this. They would be against the system. They would position the subject against the system. So the subject would be Cadell and Arielle, and the system would be the structure that would be containing our identities or holding our identities or fixing rules for our identities. And that would be what you were talking about with the fixed identity. You called it like the prison of the identity or something like this. Yeah. So in the studies or in the literature, it would be post-structuralist studies, and they would be trying to find the location of the free subject. Mm. And then now you're talking about containers, so that's where I would be interested in how your concept of the container is something different,
Yeah, beautiful. So when you were describing that, I was like, oh, that actually feels like suppression. It feels like wanting to contain or control the identity. And with a container is something that is emergent. It is malleable. It is alive. Mm-hmm. It is 100% influenceable both by the person who is in command, like holding the container. So as the person facilitating this interactive emergent course, I am holding the container. The container is made up of the energies of, the desires of, the areas for growth of, and the boundaries of each person who comes into the course. Mm-hmm. Which means that it's not fixed. And I have a strong ability to feel into what a person's experience is, and know how to shift and adapt the container so that regardless of what wants to emerge within them, they can feel and deeply know that the container is big enough and adaptable enough to hold them. Because the number one thing that we are working with right now in society, especially in American culture, is the suppression of self and the deep shame that has been carried around our sexuality, which is essentially our essence. So many people are walking around fearing that their emotions will be too much, that their experience is wrong, that it's not okay to be who they are. So in my opinion, the most skillful and powerful container is one that can constantly hold and approve of a person's experience without allowing them to bypass. So it means it's also showing a clear mirror and holding a person accountable in the places where they're playing small. So that patterning that is working counter to what they say that they want can be seen, felt, and reflected. And that regardless of how big the person allows themselves to be, that they don't feel themselves hitting up against the ceiling, which in that case means hitting up against my potential egoic fear that they could be more powerful, more alive, more vibrant than me, which means that the holder of a container must be doing their work around humility, around vulnerability, around letting go of any need to control or be put on a pedestal, because any of that will reflect as shadow into the experience that can contaminate the container.
Well, what you're articulating quite well. You're doing a good job articulating is maybe the biggest possible project ever. So intimacy by design sounds like a pretty interesting place to be, but also for a lot of people, a terrifying place to be. And my question would be, like, the first thing that comes up in my mind is, and I've had this idea in myself for a while, is like that the structures, our social systems of history, whatever, are like training wheels. And because what you're saying, the container, what I see as the distinction between the system and what you're saying is the container, is that the container is a subjectified system, and that in this subjectified system, it's as malleable and as alive and dynamic and as healthy as the subject is capable of reflecting their inner essence in a really deep and authentic way, which is a huge self project. And then my question for the Intimacy by Design course would be, say you have subjects go through this, and say you've done this a few times, say you've done this, it's an iterable process, say you've done this, a few courses or something. What happens to the subjects when they're on the other side of taking your course and things get really rough,
Well,
that's, I guess, that's an open question. That's exploratory question, I suppose.
It's a good question, because so this course, like, this is it's the second course that I've ever run where all genders can be in the course, which inherently shakes up the container even more, because there is so much suppression in the dynamics between men and women. And one of the main things that I'm seeing is the necessity to be able to shift out of villainizing the opposite sex and actually create a space where we can cultivate our own sense of safety. So we're not constantly expecting other people to show up in a specific way in order for us to feel completely comfortable. It's a yes and, because we're asking for responsibility from each person to show up in compassion and care for the community. And we're also asking for a cultivation of sovereignty. So what I would say is that this course is not for the beginner.
No, it can't be.
It's not. So, and the people who have signed up for this course, like, they've been following me on Facebook for a while, or they've been previous clients. So they're familiar with what it is that I'm bringing into the space. And this is where I also see the shift needing to occur, is where it's not just the leader is the leader and then everyone else is just following. It's an activation of the realization that each person involved in the course has something to bring into it, has wisdom to bring into it, and something to contribute to it. And that it can become very dangerous when we become passive observers of experience. Yeah. And when people come out of the course, and if their situation is getting real, if their boat is getting seriously rocked, one, I would say, is you can come into private mentorship with me. Mm-hmm. And two, I would also say it's for the person who is ready for their ship to get rocked.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So for someone listening right now who's interested, maybe for whatever reason, what would you say is the most important psychological tool or reflection for them to be reflecting on before joining your course,
let me give just a little. So the Intimacy by Design is for the person who wants to step out of the patterning and conditioning of how they've taught to engage in relationship, especially in a romantic and sexual capacity, and instead learn how to create containers for their relationships that actually support them in evolving, self-actualizing, and creating their desired reality.
Yeah, it's a big project. It's a huge project. It's such an interesting, ambitious project, and it's going to take it's going to take that person who has probably not the beginner, right? Someone who's probably got more experience.
Yep. And a big piece for me that I work with people is around their relationship to boundaries. If there was one piece that was going to be huge in this course, it's looking at what our physical boundaries are, our verbal boundaries are, and then at a deeper level, our energetic boundaries. So how we actually allow people into our life based upon what we are a yes and what we are a no to. So a lot of this course is about looking at where you're out of alignment in your life, like where you are saying yes to things that your heart and your soul are actually a no to, and creating a congruency so that you can actually start engaging in your relationships from a more conscious and intentional place.
Okay. And then in that process, my next question for you, because probably some of the people who watch this channel are interested in some of the psychoanalytic stuff. And I think the idea of the unconscious, for me, as I often define it, is a form of knowledge which is not self-conscious, basically. And so I feel like in the libidinal context or in the sexual context, we can sometimes discover boundaries or discover knowledge about ourselves which we weren't conscious of at a certain time. So I'd be maybe speak to that dimension, because you could go through an 8-week intimacy by design course and actually learn something about your boundaries or learn something about yourself which you didn't even know was there in you, right?
Yep. And you will continue to.
Yeah.
You will never, there is limitless capacity to go deeper into the wellspring of who we truly are. And it's some of the most confronting work one can ever do. And it's also some of the most liberating and fulfilling and magical things that we could ever do. And in my opinion, it's the path. It's the path of self-awakening.
Mm-hmm. So instead of, you could imagine, like I was saying in a previous conversation I was having with Genevieve, I was saying we're too, a lot of people say we're too late to be like world explorers like Columbus or something, and we're too early to be space explorers like going to another galaxy, but we're exploring this intimacy space, and it's kind of like, that's as terrifying, I would say, for some people as going onto a ship across the Atlantic when you don't know what's on the other side.
I would agree.
You know?
Intimacy, in my opinion, is a psychedelic realm that is wanting to be explored. The space that can be created between two people when we let go of the conditioning and the need to control or perceive a person in a certain way, and instead to just be there. There is limitless potential available in that space. And that is the frontier that I am apparently meant to explore in this lifetime. And I know that I'm in very good company.
Yeah, and the ego's got its monsters, and it's got its conditioning, and it's got its history. So it's wonderful that you're opening up this space. And I would just again recommend to check out Arielle's work. There's a link in the description. It'll be the first link in the description of the YouTube video if you're interested in learning about our Intimacy by Design course. It starts June 12th, and it's 8 weeks, right?
Yep.
And you get to interact with this lovely woman. That's fun. So
yeah,
is there anything else you would like to say to close out? Either like a message about what you would like people to take away about your mission, or anything you would like to say about the last thing about the meaning of why you started Intimacy by Design or something like that? Feel free.
In all honesty, I feel a lot of gratitude for the space that you hold and your enthusiasm. And I just feel very received by you. And it's the way that you speak and the way that you reflect to me helps me to see my work in an even greater capacity. And I am a big yes to constantly seeing life from different perspectives. And I really appreciate the perspective that you're coming from. So thank you for the time and the communication and the connection.
No problem. It was a fantastic discussion, I think, and I'm really excited to see where your project goes. So again, links in the description. Check it out for anyone interested. And thank you so much, Arielle, for being on this interview.
You as well. Thank you, Cadell.
Okay, recording.